Parp 1-3%, he was standing on a coral runway in the rain, looking at photographs of ships that were still floating. Major Ed Larner was 31 years old. He had flown 72 combat missions over the Pacific. He had returned from every one of them. And in those 72 missions, his squadron had not sunk a single Japanese ship. Photographs spread across the intelligence table told the same story every time. Tight bomb patterns, perfect spacing, craters in the ocean, arranged around ships like a frame around a painting, around the ships, never on them. The Japanese kept sailing. The problem was not the pilots. It was not the bombs. It was physics. And physics did not care about courage or precision or the number of men you were willing to lose trying. 1,000-pound bomb dropped from 10,000 feet takes 37 seconds to reach the water. In those 37 seconds, a Japanese destroyer traveling at 30 knots moves 380 yards, more than 3 football fields. The bombardier aims at where the ship is. The bomb lands where the ship used to be, every time, by design. By the geometry of distance and velocity, and the simple reality that high-altitude bombing against a moving target on open water is a problem that arithmetic has already solved, and the answer is not in America's favor. The 5th Air Force had been attempting to hit Japanese convoys for 8 months. The hit rate was 3%. Not 3% of ships sunk. 3% of bombs that struck a target at all. The remaining 97% detonated harmlessly in empty ocean while the convoy continued on its course. In those 8 months, Larner's squadron had lost 4 aircraft trying to do the impossible from altitude. 40 men. The Japanese shot down high-altitude bombers with methodical patience. Their gunners had time to track the approach, calculate the firing solution, and bracket the formation with anti-aircraft fire before the bombs ever left the bays. By the time ordnance fell, half the squadron was burning. General George Kenney had proposed something that sounded like madness when he first said it out loud. Kenney was 53 years old. Small, unpretentious, frequently photographed in a uniform that looked like it had survived better days than its wearer. He commanded the 5th Air Force from a desk in Australia, and he had looked at the same mathematics Larner had looked at and arrived at the only conclusion the mathematics permitted. High-altitude bombing would not sink ships. Not these ships. Not in this ocean. Something else was needed. The technique Kenney proposed was not new in theory. Naval researchers had tested versions of it before the war. The idea was simple in concept and nearly suicidal in practice. Fly in at 50 feet above the water. Release the bomb 300 yards from the target. Let momentum carry it forward. Let it skip across the surface like a flat stone thrown across a pond. Once, maybe twice, before it drives into the ship's hull and detonates at the waterline. Washington said no in December of 1942. The official response called it reckless disregard for equipment and personnel. High-altitude tactics were proven. The Norden bomb site was a national investment. Air crews should focus on established methods. Washington said no again in January of 1943 in stronger language. Larner kept practicing anyway, quietly, at dawn and dusk, when observers were few. The practice target was a ship called the Pruth, 4,700 tons of rusted steel that had run aground on Nader Reef near Port Moresby back in 1924, half submerged, going nowhere. A perfect target, the kind that doesn't shoot back. The man who made those practice runs possible was not a general and not a theorist. He was a former Navy pilot turned civilian aviator who had been living in the Philippines with his wife, Polly, and their 4 children when the Japanese attacked in December of 1941. Paul Gunn was 44 years old. Everyone called him Pappy. His family didn't make it out. Polly and the 4 children were taken by the Japanese. Pappy Gunn did not know, in the months he spent working in an aircraft maintenance depot in Australia, whether they were alive. He did not receive word. He did not have contacts in the right places. He had nothing but the work in front of him, and the knowledge that every day the war continued was another day his family remained in Japanese custody. So he worked. 5th Air Force mechanics had already begun modifying the B-25 Mitchell bomber under Kenney's direction. The bombardier position in the nose had been ripped out and replaced with 4 .50 caliber machine guns. 4 more were mounted in blisters on the fuselage sides. The modification added 1,200 pounds and shifted the center of gravity forward. The bomber was no longer a bomber in any conventional sense. It had become something between an attack aircraft and a flying gun battery, a thing that had never existed before because no one had needed it to exist before. Gunn improved it. In a corrugated tin depot outside Brisbane, working with mechanics who understood that the man in front of them was operating without sleep and with something beyond ordinary motivation. He refined the gun installation, adjusted the firing systems, and worked on the problem that nobody had solved yet: the bomb. A bomb released at 300 yards from a ship, traveling with the aircraft's forward momentum, would skip across the water and strike the hull. The physics were correct. The problem was that at 50 feet and 270 miles per hour, the aircraft releasing the bomb was still within the explosion's lethal radius when the weapon detonated. Standard fuse would destroy the aircraft that had just attacked the ship. Gunn solved it with a delay fuse, 5 seconds, long enough for the bomber to travel nearly 400 yards beyond the detonation point before the weapon exploded. Simple in principle, impossible to arrive at without understanding the exact speed and altitude and distance of the attack run. Gunn knew those numbers because Larner was flying practice runs on the Pruth, and the results of each run came back to the depot as data. Lieutenant Jake Fawcett flew the run that first demonstrated the problem. He came in at 70 feet instead of 50. The bomb skipped twice, cleared the Pruth entirely, and detonated harmlessly 300 yards beyond the wreck. No damage, no result. The approach had been off by 20 feet and the entire weapon was wasted. His bombardier, Sergeant Mike Russo, 22 years old from somewhere in New Jersey that he never stopped talking about, ran the calculations again. Not the aiming calculation, the physics calculation. Approach altitude, water contact angle, skip trajectory, hull penetration depth. He adjusted every variable and handed the results back to Fawcett with one sentence: lower, faster, closer. Fawcett came in at 45 feet on the next run. The bomb skipped once. It struck the Pruth's hull just below the waterline, exactly where a ship's magazine would be, exactly where one bomb could detonate 1,000 tons of ammunition and break a destroyer in half. The Pruth didn't explode. It was already a wreck, already empty, already dead. But the technique had worked. The Japanese convoy left Rabaul on March 1st, 1943. 8 troop transports, 8 destroyers, 6,912 soldiers, bound for Lae in New Guinea. American intelligence had intercepted the departure. Larner stood on the rain-soaked runway at Port Moresby and looked at the reconnaissance photographs spread across the briefing table. 8 fat transports in 2 columns, destroyers screening the flanks, every ship packed with men who would be fighting Allied soldiers in the jungle if they reached their destination. Thought about Buna. The campaign there had lasted 6 months and cost 5,000 Allied casualties. Lae, reinforced by 7,000 fresh troops, would be worse, much worse. He had an idea. It had been banned twice. It had been called suicide by every pilot who heard it described. It had been proven effective exactly once, on a ship that was already a wreck and wasn't shooting back. The convoy would be in striking range in 3 hours. Harp 250 feet at 745 on the morning of March 2nd, 1943, Major Ed Larner released the brakes on his V-25 and began his takeoff roll. He did not speak to his crew. They had flown together for 9 months. They knew what 50 feet meant. They knew the odds. Nobody needed it explained. Plan was layered, which was the only reason it had any chance of working. 16 B-17 Flying Fortresses would attack from 10,000 feet first, not because they were expected to sink anything, but because they would force the Japanese ships to maneuver. Convoy breaking formation to avoid high-altitude bombs is a convoy whose destroyers are accelerating in different directions, whose anti-aircraft gunners are tracking threats above them, whose captains are watching the sky instead of the horizon. Confusion was worth more than accuracy. 13 Beaufighters from the Royal Australian Air Force would arrive at wave-top heights simultaneously. Their job was not to sink ships either. Their job was to rake the destroyer decks with 20mm cannon fire, to give the anti-aircraft crews a reason to get their heads down, to make them choose between operating their weapons and surviving the next 30 seconds. Above it all, 16 P-38 Lightnings would engage whatever Japanese Zero fighters appeared at altitude. The P-38s were the ceiling. Without them, the entire plan collapsed the moment the Zeros arrived. And then, while the convoy was maneuvering, and the gunners were ducking, and the Zeros were occupied, Larner's 9 B-25s would come in from the surface. 50 feet, 270 miles per hour. Machine guns firing from 300 yards out. Bomb release at 300 yards. 5-second fuse. Pull up hard, and pray the shockwave doesn't flip you into the ocean. The formation flew to the Bismarck Sea, at 30 feet above the water, low enough that spray from the wave tops occasionally hit the windscreens. Radio silence the entire way. One transmission and the convoy would know they were coming. Surprise was the only advantage they had, and it was worth more than every other advantage combined. At 852, Larner spotted smoke on the horizon. Black diesel exhaust from 16 ships steaming in formation. He keyed his throat microphone once, a single click. His wingmen acknowledged with single clicks of their own. Radio discipline holding. The convoy took shape as they closed the distance. 2 columns of transports, 4 ships per column. Destroyers 2 miles ahead and on both flanks. Larner counted gun positions on the nearest destroyer. 6 main turrets. Dozens of smaller weapons. Every barrel capable of tracking a bomber at 50 feet. At 857, the Beaufighters went in. Larner watched from 3 miles out as 13 aircraft dove on the convoy from the northeast. Their cannons raked the destroyer decks. Tracers arced across the water. The Japanese anti-aircraft guns swung toward the new threat. 30 seconds later, the B-17s arrived at altitude. Bomb bay doors opened. Bombs tumbled toward the convoy. The Japanese ships began evasive maneuvers, turning hard, columns breaking apart, destroyers accelerating to flank speed with white water foaming at their sterns. Fusion. Perfect. Larner pulled back on the throttles and descended to 40 feet. His airspeed dropped to 260 miles per hour. His bombardier, Staff Sergeant Carl Walls, was calling out distances. 4,000 yards, 3,800, 3,600. Each ship in the convoy was now clearly visible. Larner picked his target, the second transport in the port column, 700 feet long, sitting low in the water, fully loaded. Bomb would hit amidships, right where the troop compartments were. The destroyer on the left flank spotted them, muzzle flashes. The first shells arced toward the formation, too high. The Japanese gunners were calibrated for altitude. They hadn't adjusted yet. 2,000 yards, Larner opened fire. All 850 caliber machine guns hammered simultaneously. Tracers walked across the transport superstructure. Glass shattered. Metal sparked. Men on the deck dropped or dove for cover. The suppression was working. The anti-aircraft crews couldn't return fire while 800 rounds per minute were tearing through their positions. 1,200 yards. His wingmen were spreading out, each bomber lining up on its assigned target. 9 bombers attacking 9 ships simultaneously. No time for the defenders to shift their fire, no time to concentrate on any single threat. 800 yards. The destroyer's main guns fired again. The shells bracketed Larner's flight, left, right, close enough to rock the aircraft with concussion. Shrapnel pinged off the fuselage. Co-pilot Tom Benz called out without turning his head. Port engine oil pressure dropping. Still in the green. 600 yards. The transport filled the windscreen. Individual soldiers were visible on the deck, scrambling for cover. The bridge windows. The gun crews swinging their weapons. Every instinct Larner had accumulated across 72 combat missions was screaming at him to pull up, to climb, to get away from at a combined closing speed of nearly 300 miles per hour, 400 yards. Wall's voice cut through the engine noise. Bomb armed, ready for release, 300 yards. Larner pressed the release. He felt the aircraft lurch upward as 1,000 pounds dropped free. The bomb tumbled forward, carried by momentum. It hit the water nose first, skipped once across the surface like a stone thrown flat, and drove into the transport's hull at the waterline. Larner was already pulling back on the controls, climbing hard, his vision filled with sky. The 5-second fuse counted down. The shock wave hit his aircraft like something physical. It lifted the tail and threw the B-25 sideways. Benz fought the controls. The altimeter spun through 100 feet, 200, 300. When Larner risked a glance back, the transport was coming apart. A column of fire and black smoke erupted from amidships. The deck buckled, metal shrieked. Secondary explosions ripped through the superstructure as ammunition stores cooked off. The ship was listing to port already, taking water through a hole that had no right to exist from a single bomb dropped by a single aircraft at 50 feet. Soldiers were jumping overboard. Dozens of them. Tiny figures abandoning a ship that had been moving under its own power 15 seconds ago. One bomb. 15 seconds from release to catastrophic structural failure. Technique worked. To Larner's right, Lieutenant Jake Fawcett was pulling up from his own attack run. Another transport was burning, flames climbing its forward mast. To the left, Captain Johnson had just released on the convoy flagship. The bomb had skipped once and punched through the hull just forward of the bridge. The delay fuse had given it time to penetrate 3 decks before detonating. The explosion tore through the cargo holds. The flagship became an inferno. Men were burning on deck, jumping into the sea, trailing smoke. 4 targets hit in the first 90 seconds. Then Tom Mitchell's aircraft disappeared. Larner saw the muzzle flashes from the destroyer on the far flank, saw the shells walk across the water toward Mitchell's B-25. The first shell missed by 50 yards, the second by 20, the third hit. Mitchell's aircraft didn't crash. It ceased to exist. The bomb under the fuselage detonated on impact. The explosion was instantaneous and total. When Larner looked, there was no wreckage recognizable as an airplane. Just debris scattered across the surface of the ocean. 5 men, between one heartbeat and the next. Larner processed this in the same part of his mind that had processed every casualty in 72 missions. Compartment that could receive information and file it without allowing it to affect the aircraft's heading or altitude or the calculations still running in his head. There was nothing he could do for Mitchell. There were still 8 other bombers attacking 8 other ships, and some of those crews were still alive, and they needed the attack to succeed. Kept flying. Lieutenant Paul Warren took hits during his approach. A Japanese gunner on one of the destroyers had finally adjusted for the low-altitude attack. 20-millimeter shells ripped through Warren's port wing. Fuel streamed from the punctured tank. Warren held his course. 300 yards. 200. At 150 yards, less than half the planned release distance, he pressed the release. The bomb skipped and struck the transport below the waterline. Warren banked hard right, trailing fire. His co-pilot activated the suppression system. The flames died. The bomber was still flying. Barely. Lieutenant Harold Jensen was not as precise. His approach angle was wrong. Too shallow. The bomb skipped 3 times, cleared the target destroyer completely, and detonated harmlessly beyond the convoy. Jensen pulled up, circled hard, and lined up for a second approach. The destroyer he had missed tracked him through the entire turn. He was waiting when he came around. The first shell took off his port engine. The second hit the cockpit. Jensen's B-25 rolled inverted and went into the ocean at 300 miles per hour. No explosion on contact. No parachutes. The ocean simply absorbed the aircraft and kept moving. 2 bombers down in the first 4 minutes. But 7 transports were burning or sinking. Major Ralph Chelly led the second wave in from 5 miles out. He had watched the first attack from that distance. He knew the technique worked. He also knew the Japanese were not the same enemy they had been 6 minutes ago. Every gun in the convoy was now calibrated for low altitude. The gunners who had survived the first wave had made their adjustments. They were tracking low. They were firing early. They were waiting for the committed approach, the moment when a bomber had to hold course regardless of what was coming toward it. Chelly came in from the east, directly into the rising sun. The Japanese gunners were squinting, firing at shadows. His bomb hit a transport that was already listing. The explosion accelerated the sinking. The ship rolled onto its side and went under in less than 2 minutes. Second wave pressed its attacks for 4 more minutes. When the last B-25 pulled away, 11 minutes had passed since Larner's first bomb hit the water. 7 transports were sinking. 4 destroyers were damaged. 2 were dead in the water. And the Japanese had 60 Zero fighters somewhere above the scattered clouds. And they had just decided it was time to use them. Zeros appeared at 9:15. 18 of them diving from 12,000 feet. The P-38s were supposed to keep them occupied. Something had gone wrong. Either the Lightnings had been outnumbered, or a second Japanese fighter group had arrived undetected. Either way, the B-25s were suddenly alone at low altitude with aircraft designed to kill them dropping out of the sky above them. Larner pushed his throttles forward and descended to 20 feet. 15. The propellers were churning salt spray. He jinked left, then right, making himself a target that was difficult to track. Behind him, Staff Sergeant Tommy Blake, in the dorsal turret, was firing controlled bursts at the nearest Zero. The Japanese fighter broke off, not damaged, just unwilling to commit. Warren's damaged bomber wasn't as fortunate. A Zero latched onto his tail and stayed there. Warren tried every evasive maneuver he knew. Nothing worked. The Zero pilot was patient in the way that experienced fighter pilots are patient, waiting for the moment when Warren ran out of airspeed in a climbing turn, then firing a 2-second burst. Warren's starboard engine exploded. The bomber went into the ocean. 3 parachutes, 3 out of 5. Zero attack lasted 6 minutes. Then they broke off and climbed. B-17s were coming back for a second high-altitude pass. The Zero pilots chose the bigger threat. The low-altitude bombers were already leaving. The convoy was already dying. Larner assessed his situation. Port engine running rough. Oil pressure fluctuating. Fuel gauge showing 60%. Enough to reach Port Moresby. Maybe. He looked back at the convoy. 7 transports hit. 7 sinking or already gone. 1 transport, the 8th, was burning but still making way toward the New Britain coast. 4 destroyers in the screening line, 2 dead in the water, 2 circling the burning transports trying to recover survivors. The initial attack had lasted 11 minutes. The killing would continue for 3 more days. Harp 3, what the mathematics cost Larner, landed at Port Moresby at 11:17 on the morning of March 2nd, 1943. Cut the engines and sat in the cockpit for 30 seconds with his hands still on the controls. Ben sat beside him. Neither man moved. They had been in the air for 3 hours and 42 minutes. The feel of it was somewhere in the range of 3 days. The debriefing lasted 2 hours. Intelligence officers asked the same questions, in different forms. How many ships hit? How many sinking? How many bombs released? How many aircraft lost? They were assembling a picture from fragments, because 5 of the 9 bombers that had taken off that morning had returned. Mitchell gone. Jensen gone. Warren's crew in the water, to be recovered by a Catalina flying boat. 2 wounded. The reconnaissance photographs arrived at 1 in the afternoon. An Australian Beaufort had photographed the convoy from altitude at noon. The images told the story that Larner's surviving crews could only approximate. 8 transports, 7 confirmed sunk or sinking. The 8th beached on the New Britain coast, burning, 4 destroyers, 2 sunk, 2 withdrawing toward Rabaul, severely damaged. General Kenney arrived at Port Moresby at 4 in the afternoon. He walked directly to the operations tent, spread the photographs across the table, and looked at the beached transport for a moment. Then he said 2 words: finish it. The strikes continued through March 3rd and into March 4th. B-25s returned every 6 hours. PT boats hunted survivors in lifeboats. The beached transport was destroyed at dusk on March 2nd. The 2 withdrawing destroyers were caught trying to reach Rabaul and sunk. The Japanese had committed 16 ships to this operation. By nightfall on March 4th, 14 were on the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. Final accounting came through on March 7th. 8 transports sunk. 4 destroyers sunk. Approximately 3,000 soldiers drowned. Another 1,500 killed by air attack. 1,200 reached lay overland through the jungle, arriving without weapons, without supplies, without organization. They were combat ineffective. The reinforcement operation had failed completely. American losses across the entire 3-day battle: 4 B-25s, 1 B-17, 2 P-38s, 13 aircrew killed, 6 wounded. Against an entire Japanese convoy, the exchange rate was one-sided in a way that made military planners look at the numbers twice to confirm they were reading them correctly. What the numbers didn't show was the mathematics that ran in the other direction. Of the 62 pilots that Larner would eventually train in skip bombing before rotating home in May of 1,943, 18 were killed in action, a 29% fatality rate. 23 more were wounded, total casualty rate of 66%. Better than high-altitude bombing in terms of ships sunk per aircraft lost. Worse than almost any other role in combat aviation in terms of what it did to the men who flew it. Skip bombing worked. It also broke the men it required. Pilots who flew these missions had shorter combat tours than their counterparts in other roles. Higher rates of what the Army Air Forces called combat fatigue. More frequent medical groundings for reasons that the paperwork described in clinical language and that the men in question would have described differently if they had been willing to describe them at all. Larner stopped flying skip bombing missions after May. He requested a transfer to transport aircraft, C-47s, moving supplies and personnel across the Pacific. No combat. No more missions where he would watch crews he had trained take off and not return. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel in December of 1943. He declined the promotion twice before accepting. Command understood, could keep flying combat after what they had seen and done. Others couldn't. There was no shame in either direction. In June of 1945, the war finally delivered information that Pappy Gunn had been unable to obtain for more than 3 years. Manila was liberated. Polly and the 4 children were alive. They had been held in Japanese internment camps since 1942. 3 years. They were alive, and he hadn't known, and the work he had done in corrugated tin depots in Australia had been powered by the specific uncertainty of not knowing. Gunn flew to Manila as soon as he could arrange it. Whatever that reunion looked like, he kept it private. He was not a man who performed his emotions for audiences. The technique he had refined in those depots became standard doctrine. The British adopted skip bombing for attacks on German convoys off Norway. The Soviets applied it in the Black Sea and Baltic. By 1944, coordinated attacks had developed into a 3-layer system that the Americans refined through trial and error across 2 years of Pacific warfare. High-altitude bombers forced evasive maneuvers. Fighters suppressed anti-aircraft fire. Skip bombers came in low while the defenses were fractured and disorganized. On November 2nd, 1943, 38 B-25s attacked Rabaul Harbor. 18 warships received direct hits. The raid lasted 18 minutes. American losses, 2 B-25s. The exchange rate that skip bombing had established held. After the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, the Japanese Navy canceled large-scale convoy operations within range of Allied land-based air power. The supply line to New Guinea was severed. Garrisons at Lae, Salamaua, and Madang would have to survive on what they already had. They wouldn't survive long. Islands fell. The war moved closer to Japan. Japanese Navy couldn't stop it because they couldn't feed their forward positions. Skip bombing hadn't won the war by itself, but it had closed the route the Japanese needed to keep fighting in New Guinea. Kenney received credit in the historical accounts. He had conceived proof in it worked. The distinction mattered to historians. Larner never said whether it mattered to him. He didn't give interviews. He didn't write a memoir. He returned to the United States in September of 1945, mustered out 3 months later with a Distinguished Flying Cross, 2 air medals, and a Purple Heart from shrapnel wounds he had never mentioned in any after-action report. He moved to Sacramento, California. He lived a life that left no particular record in the public domain. He died in 1997 at the age of 85. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his military service in one sentence. It did not mention the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. It did not mention skip bombing. It did not mention that the technique he had helped develop was still influencing maritime strike doctrine 50 years after the war ended. He had asked his family not to discuss it. They honored his request. B-25 Mitchells that flew at the Bismarck Sea were worn out by war's end. Most were scrapped. A few survive in museums, restored to flying condition or displayed as static exhibits. None of them flew on March 2nd and 3rd, 1943. The aircraft that actually flew those missions were worked until they couldn't fly anymore, and then they were taken apart for the aluminum. The Pruth, the rusted hulk on Nader Reef, where Larner's crews practiced in the dark before dawn, is still there. It has been underwater for most of a century now. The practice runs that happened around it before March of 1943 are documented in after-action reports that most people will never read, in archives that most people will never visit. What remains is simpler than the documents. On March 2nd and 3rd, 1943, 9 B-25 bombers flew at 50 feet above the Bismarck Sea and destroyed an entire Japanese convoy. The tactic had been banned twice. The men who flew it knew the odds. They flew it anyway, because the alternative was 7,000 enemy soldiers arriving in New Guinea, and the war grinding on for another year through jungles already soaked in Allied blood. Technique was called suicide before they proved it worked. It was called decisive afterward. The truth was somewhere in between. It was desperation and mathematics meeting at 50 feet above the water. It was men hold course while anti-aircraft fire turned the air into metal, because the mission required a steady approach, and a steady approach required the decision, made in advance and maintained under pressure, to not flinch. Ed Larner died in Sacramento in 1997, and his obituary ran one sentence about the war, and that was exactly what he had asked for. Some things you do because they need to be done. You don't need credit for them. You just need them to be finished.